Look who's joined us. Alongside Scott is David Cochrane for the political response. So, David, 5.9%, as Scott was indicating, the Bank of Canada, the interest rate measures seem to be having an effect. It does take some time, as we know. What's likely to be the reaction to this in Ottawa, and how much of a challenge does inflation continue to be for the government?
Well, it is moving in the right direction, as Scott said, right? But to use the analogy that Peter Armstrong uses so often, with a target rate of 2%, at 5.9% is like a car doing 59 in a 20 zone. It's slowing down, but it's still going way too fast. And politically, Heather, you've got the challenges that in a lot of the areas where people spend most of their money, food, energy, and housing, the numbers there are still high and well above what the headline rate is on inflation. So it's moving in the right direction and maybe take some pressure off the Bank of Canada. Maybe they look at this and hold where they are. But as Scott said, it's still a pretty hot inflation report. You stack that on top of a better than expected job numbers earlier this month, about 10 times higher than experts predicted, with 150,000 new jobs and unemployment rate of 5%. You know, Tiff Macklem, the governor of the Bank of Canada, said that they would sort of pause and assess where all the data is going. You know, as you and Peter and everyone talk about so often, sort of monetary policy, the labor market, and inflation are acting in a way that we've never really seen before because of all the various global shocks and things that are happening, like wheat, for example, as Scott just mentioned, caused so much by what's happening in Ukraine and been going on there for the past year. Politically, I think you'll still see Pierre Poilievre seizing on meat numbers, dairy numbers, you know, baked goods numbers, mortgage numbers, housing, in particular housing policy, the inability of younger Canadians to find a permanent place to live, to buy property, is an enormous political tension right now in the country, Heather, and nothing in this inflation report suggests that getting a mortgage and buying a house is going to get any easier. But in the long-term trend, when you consider, I think it was July, we're at about 8.1%. It's come a long way, but still got a long way to go.
So are you hearing anything yet, whether there will be any specific measures in the upcoming budget to address Canadians, you know, having to pay more for, we always talk about the rising cost of everything? Any specific budgetary measures, David?
Well, I think we saw a lot of stuff last fall. If you remember, it was back in September, shortly after they had the cabinet retreat out in Vancouver. There was a series of measures, the $500 rental top-up for low-income Canadians, the doubling of the GST rebate, for example, and measures that way targeting, very narrow and targeted, at low-income Canadians and working-income Canadians, trying to find a way to help them deal with this. Because one of the concerns the government has, and they've been criticized for all the spending they had to do during the pandemic as being a driver of inflation. They don't want to throw more fuel onto the inflationary fire. And, you know, if you look at the job market, an unemployment of 5% right now and a lot of unfilled jobs out there, that perhaps takes some of the pressure off of them to take extreme measures. But the way they're looking at it now is that if they do anything, it will be very much targeted at people below certain income cutoffs, because they're the people less able to absorb these double-digit increases in meat and in dairy that we've seen over the past year, unable to absorb the increases in rents and in mortgage payments that we've seen over the past year. So if there is anything in the upcoming budget, Heather, it's going to be on that. Okay. But more likely they're going to try to bend their deficits back towards sort of pre-pandemic levels as best they can.
Also watching, of course, when the budget comes out, for any line items on Canada's military, ongoing support for the war in Ukraine. The anniversary, the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion, is this Friday. And this morning, David, we're watching U.S. President Joe Biden in Poland reiterating American support for Ukraine for the long haul. What are you expecting from the Trudeau government as the war enters its second year?
I think in some of the big requests right now that the Ukrainian President Zelensky has made, Canada is very limited in its ability to help, right? He wants fighter jets. Canada was able to only send 4 tanks because we have a fleet of about 80 tanks in our military. Only a couple of dozen of them are fully operational and battle ready. And so only 4 could be spared because of, you know, maintenance requirements and parts. The F-35s is an ongoing saga. The planes that we have are limited in their capacity and certainly not numerous enough that they could be shared in any sort of excess capacity with Ukraine if NATO and sort of the Ramstein group decides to go in that direction. It takes time to train people on how to fly these jets, as a lot of the Ukrainian military would have learned how to fly in Soviet MiGs, for example. And then there's the issue of whether these planes could be used to strike inside Russian territory, and NATO has long sought to sort of stop the war from escalating and expanding. So we saw Mélanie Joly, the Foreign Affairs Minister, in Kyiv last week. She announced another $21 million in aid aid, mostly to help with sexual violence, for example, and the prosecution of war crimes once this conflict hopefully ends. And I had the Ukrainian ambassador to Canada, Yulia Kovalich, on the show last night, and she was talking about how they're grateful for Canada's help with the demining efforts, because about 30% of Ukrainian territory and farmland is now riddled with landmines. And we talk about the price of wheat going up. We talk about food insecurity around the globe when one of the breadbaskets of the world has its farmers' fields full of explosive devices. That is a severe limiting factor at any attempt of a return to normal. So Canada's help, you've heard from the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister in particular, they are prepared to continue to support the effort in Ukraine. They're rebuilding, issuing bonds to underwrite government operations, because they don't just have to fight a war. They have to run a country and pay a civil service and manage their debts. But the big ask of the fighter jets that exists right now is not something I think Canada can really answer the call on. That's going to be France, that's going to be the UK, and that's going to be the United States. And like there was in the early stages of the war, Heather, there was a reluctance to even give any kind of lethal aid. First, they weren't going to give tanks. Now there's tanks. They weren't going to give, air defense. They weren't going to give the Patriot missile systems. And now all of those are either there or on their way to Ukraine. So certainly there's a frustration with Ukrainian officials saying, let's make a long story short and give us what we need. Otherwise, you're just going to extend this conflict and increase the number of lives that are lost.
I introduced you just as David Cochrane in with some political response. I should have, of course, and will, for the future, introduce you as the host of Power and Politics. We had that officially confirmed just the other day. So, number one, congratulations,
Thank you.
David. Very excited. We've been speaking face to face. We were looking through the archives for a very long time. Remember 2009?
Yeah.
And atop Signal Hill, where we learned the challenges of broadcasting live at that location. That was after the terrible tragedy of the Cougar helicopter crash. But there we were there. Met you then, and here we are in 2023, taking over as Power and Politics. It's just fantastic. I'm just wondering your view of the role and where you want to take the program, David.
Well, I have a theory that the company actually thought they were hiring David Cochrane to do this job, and it was too late by the time they realized their mistake. Look, I think this is an important show, and this is at a very important time, right? Politics, there's a lot of division, there's a lot of polarization, there's a lot of misinformation, and there's a lot of anger. And very often, political conversation and debate can just turn into conflict and arguing and the recitation of talking points. And I don't know if I can do that, Heather, but I want to try to move past that. I want it to be a conversation where it's not just conflict and fighting all the time. People learn something. They're able to dig deeper on ideas and have some longer conversations, and also have it be a little bit fun. It's a serious show that does serious topics, but it doesn't necessarily have to take itself so seriously. And the other thing I really want to do is I want to highlight journalism and journalists and good work. And last week, for example, we had David Ryder on, the bureau chief for the Toronto Star at Toronto City Hall, to talk about the work they did on John Tory, the story they broke there. We had Steve Chase from the Globe and Mail on to talk about the revelations that him and Bob Fife had on allegations of Chinese meddling and interference in Canadian elections. Journalists and journalism is under attack right now. It is being ridiculed and criticized and discredited. And I think it's important for us in the profession to pull together, stand together, and celebrate each other's good work, because we may be competitors, but we're colleagues, and the institutions that we represent are important to a functioning country and a functioning democracy. And one of the things I really want to do on the 2 hours we have every day is to have journalists on to talk about the work they're doing, explain how it happened, explain why it's important, and elevate it above the criticism of fake news and partisan bias agendas. I think it's an important thing to do at this time, because let's face it, Heather, if we don't stick up for each other, there's not a lot of people out there sticking up for us.
You're right on that. Listen, the Commons Committee recalled based on that Globe and Mail reporting last week, and they're meeting in an extraordinary session today to deal with some of the things that they raised in that journalism. David, that sounds quite fantastic. We'll be watching, and congratulations again. You always have a place. We'll always make time for you whenever you have time for us. Okay, sounds good. David Cochrane from Ottawa,
Thanks,
your
Heather.
new host of Power and Politics on CBC News Network.